Every culture that has ever existed tells the story of a great flood. The water rises. Almost everything is destroyed. A small group of survivors rebuild. The Mesopotamians wrote it as the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written stories in human history. The Hebrews wrote it as Noah. The ancient Greeks had Deucalion, who built a chest and floated on the floodwaters until he landed on a mountain. The Hindus have Manu, warned by a fish to build a great boat. The Aztecs, the Chinese, the Norse, the indigenous peoples of North America, Australia, and Polynesia. All of them. The same story, and that's just the flood. Every culture also tells the story of a god or hero who dies and comes back. Osiris in Egypt, Dionysus in Greece, Odin, who hung himself on the world tree for 9 days to gain wisdom, Persephone, who descends into the underworld and returns each spring, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Balder in Norse mythology, the Corn King in dozens of agricultural traditions, death and resurrection, over and over. Every culture has a trickster, a figure who breaks the rules, causes chaos, and somehow makes things better. Loki in Norse mythology, Coyote in Native American traditions, Anansi the spider in West African and Caribbean stories, Hermes in ancient Greece, Raven in the Pacific Northwest, Sun Wukong in Chinese mythology. Every culture has a great serpent or dragon who must be defeated, a hero who descends into the underworld, a primordial chaos from which a god creates order. The same stories, different names, different faces, same bones. The question that nobody ever fully answers in school is how. How does this happen? And the answer turns out to be one of the most profound things we know about the human mind. Let's start with the flood, because this one has the most obvious candidate explanation, and the most interesting reason why that explanation isn't enough. The obvious theory is that the flood myths all trace back to a single real event, a catastrophic flood so large it entered the collective memory of early humanity and spread outward as populations migrated. There is genuine geological evidence for massive flooding events in human prehistory. The flooding of the Black Sea Basin around 7,500 years ago. The end of the last ice age, which raised sea levels by over 400 feet worldwide, submerging enormous amounts of coastal land where early human populations lived. These events would have been catastrophic for the people who experienced them, and the stories they generated would have been passed down for generations. This explains some flood myths. It does not explain the flood myths of peoples who had no connection to the Black Sea or the coastal flooding of the Ice Age melt, the Aboriginal Australians, the indigenous peoples of inland South America. The flood myth appears in cultures where no credible geological catastrophe connects to the story, which means the flood myth is not just a memory of a real event. It is something else, too. It is something the human mind generates independently, given the right conditions. And here is what those conditions are. The flood myth is not really about water. It is about the end of the world and the beginning of a new one. It is about the terrifying reality that everything familiar can be taken away, that civilization is fragile, that survival requires preparation and obedience to forces larger than the individual. Every human community that has ever existed has faced moments when everything familiar was swept away. Drought, disease, invasion, climate shifts. The flood is the metaphor the human brain reaches for when it needs to process the experience of total catastrophic loss, followed by survival and rebuilding. The water is interchangeable. The structure of the story is universal because the emotional experience it encodes is universal. This is the key insight. Myths are not reports of historical events. They are emotional and psychological software. Stories shaped by the human nervous system to encode experiences that the nervous system needs to process and transmit. This is what Carl Jung was pointing at in the early 20th century when he proposed the concept of archetypes and the collective unconscious. Jung had treated patients from across Europe and studied myths from cultures worldwide, and he kept finding the same figures appearing: the Great Mother, the Shadow, the Trickster, the Hero, the Wise Old Man. They appeared in his patient's dreams. They appeared in myths from cultures his patients had never encountered. And Jung argued that this was not coincidence. These figures were not invented by individual cultures. They were structural features of the human psyche, patterns that the mind generates because the mind is built the same way everywhere. The collective unconscious was his term for the layer of the mind beneath personal memory, the layer that all humans share, where these patterns live. Modern cognitive science has largely validated the underlying observation while updating the explanation. We don't need a mystical shared unconscious to explain universal archetypes. We just need to recognize that human brains are built from the same evolved architecture everywhere, processing the same fundamental challenges everywhere and generating the same narrative solutions everywhere. The trickster figure appears in every culture not because of ancient contact, but because every human society needs a cognitive framework for processing the value of rule breaking. The dying god appears everywhere because every human mind needs a framework for processing death and renewal. The great serpent appears everywhere because the human amygdala has a deeply ancient threat response to snake-like shapes that predates our species and generates the same symbolic weight across all cultures. In 2018, cognitive scientist Pascal Boyer and anthropologist Brian Malley published research examining the structure of supernatural agent beliefs across cultures. They found that humans universally generate supernatural agents with a specific cognitive profile. These agents are almost human, but not quite. They have access to information humans don't have. They are interested in and affected by human moral behavior, and they are capable of violating the normal rules of physics. This profile, which describes gods and spirits across virtually every human religious tradition, is not culturally transmitted. It is generated by the human mind's social cognition systems, which evolved to track other agents' beliefs, intentions, and knowledge. When applied to the question of what lies beyond human perception, these systems automatically generate entities that match this universal profile. The gods of every culture are the product of the same neural machinery applied to the same ultimate questions. What this means is that the stories are not really about the specific characters in them. Osiris and Dionysus and the Corn King are not the same person, but they encode the same truth, that death is followed by renewal, that the thing that appears to end is transformed rather than destroyed, that the cycle of loss and return is the fundamental rhythm of existence. The flood destroys the familiar and forces a new beginning. The trickster breaks the rules and discovers that the rules needed breaking. The hero descends into darkness and returns with something that changes the world. These are not stories about ancient gods. These are stories about the structure of change itself, and the human nervous system has been telling them in every language and every culture because the human nervous system needs them, the way a body needs food. You have heard these stories your entire life. You just didn't recognize them as the same story. The hero who descends into darkness and returns transformed is every story you have ever loved, every film where the character loses everything and rebuilds, every narrative where the lowest point turns out to be the turning point. The trickster who breaks the rules and makes things better is every character you've rooted for who refused to play by the system. The flood that destroys the familiar world and forces a new beginning is every story of collapse and rebuilding that has ever moved you. These are ancient myths, running on modern hardware. The names have changed. The gods have been replaced by characters who drive cars and carry phones. But the bones of the story are the same bones they have always been, because the mind that needs them is the same mind it has always been, yours.